Thank you. Welcome to our session. I'm starting the session, and then Peggy will be the speaker for most of the session. I want to give you an overview of what we'll be doing after I thank those of the organizers who've set this up for us. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Alex, for putting together this wonderful conference. We're going to be talking very briefly about cognition and language learning, our focus. And then we will turn to a single study of word learning in a talented language learner. We'll tell you about our TLL, Talented Language Learners, language background. We'll tell you about the word learning task that Peggy created. We'll tell you about the method she used to compare our talented language learner to normal second language learners and people who have difficulty with learning a second language. She'll tell you the results, and we will give you some conclusions on how cognitive strands are created in the cognitive abilities that permit, of a rope, that permit us to learn second languages and beyond. Then we'll have time for questions, we trust. So there are four theory concepts that we wanted to bring up that have been contributing to our thinking about talented language learning. There's the Geschwind and Gjerlow theory of talent, of various sorts of talent in the brain, which argues that there's a biological basis to talents. And even in fetal brain development in any individual, more cells may head to one brain region, say for language learning, and fewer cells may head to another region, say for creating art, for example. The second theory that has influenced our thinking about talented language learning is plasticity theory, which argues that brain development can continue throughout the lifespan in response to what the brain is exposed to and practices. You may have heard of the research done on taxi drivers in London. You know, unlike in New York where they don't exactly need to know where to go before GPS. In London, you have to study for 2 or 3 years to learn every little detail. And as a result, their brains change and they have larger visuospatial memory regions. The third theory that influences our thinking about talented second language learning is dynamic systems theory, a very large complex theory, which each of these I'm just giving short shrift to introduce them. Dynamic systems theory says learning requires both internal to the person within the individual and external in the environment, resources, in order to learn anything. And for our purposes, the systems of languages that the learner creates change over time based on exposure and use and motivation and practice for retention, as many polyglots do. And the fourth model that we find important to think about talented language learning is Erard's rope model. Am I the only one hearing this? Does it mean we're having a fire alarm? We just ignore it, it's New York. Okay. Is Erard's rope model, which suggests that learning requires a number of cognitive skills. People will be stronger at some and weaker at others. Polyglots will presumably need language learning-related skills in addition to hard work in order to succeed as polyglots in acquiring a number of languages. We wondered which cognitive skills are strong in polyglots and which need not be strong, but for someone to still be able to succeed as a polyglot, and how the skills relate to one clearly crucial skill in learning a new language, which is learning new words, their sounds and their meanings. In particular, we asked if learning new words was particularly fast in polyglots, with less exposure necessary, and If that was merely because they were better at all cognitive tasks, I'm sure all of us in the room like to think we're particularly smart, or, whether they were particularly good at all cognitive tasks, or only a certain subset that are useful for learning a second language, the ones that are necessary in the strand of the rope. So what we did was we compared learning new words to 4 cognitive skills, repeating strings of nonsense syllables, we call this non-word repetition, recalling a visual pattern, Peggy will show you how we did it, visual memory, learning lists of unrelated real words, we call that word list learning, and keeping words in mind while listening to sentences, and we call that verbal memory. So I turn the podium over to Peggy Conner.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you very much for staying for our talk. So let me tell you a little bit about TLL's language background. This is our talented language learner. TLL is a right-handed male who at the time of testing knew more than 20 languages. And he identifies as a polyglot, he gets pleasure from learning languages, and he has deliberately studied many. If we look at the relative proficiency across languages, what we asked TLL to do was to rate his languages, rate his proficiency in the languages that he knew. And he rated them, as you can see, all above word level, a little less than a third at basic conversational level, another little less than a third at the level of being fluent, and around 40% either proficient or native-like. So now I'm going to tell you about our study. So we tested one polyglot, TLL. We also tested 23 second language learners, and we put in quotations normal. These are typical folks. And we also tested 16 individuals with dyslexia. And people with dyslexia often have difficulty with second language learning. So we wanted to compare the 3 groups. This is a task, I'm going to tell you about the word learning task. Now, this is a task that was developed in the lab of Holly Storkel at the University of Kansas for use with children and adults, which we then adapted for this experiment. There were 16 novel words that we presented in the context of 2 stories. Oops! In the context of 2 stories. We tested how well the participants learned the words several times following repetitions of the words. And these novel words were paired with novel objects, which I'm going to show you in a minute. So here's an example. So for example, Zug. They would see this object in the context of a story, and we would say, the characters in the story would call it a Zug, or the characters in the story would call it a Zaun. So I want to emphasize that this was verbal only. So there were no written words. And in the course of 4 exciting episodes in 2 different stories, these characters repeat the novel words. So we had 4 different episodes, and we repeated the novel words in each episode. Up to the end of the 4th episode, they would have heard the words 10 times. And after each episode, we tested them. How well did they remember the words? So first, we showed them the objects. We showed them all the items, and we said, these are the objects you're going to be learning the names of, without telling them what they were called. Then they listened to the episodes, and they tried to remember the names of the objects. And there were 4 different post-tests, and then after a 2-hour delay, we tested them again to see how well they retained the names. So I'm going to show you an example of the exciting story that we showed.
Mary said, "Where are the toys?" Mary looked and looked for her fag. Where would be a good hiding place for the fag? I hope I can find the fag. Mary looked very hard. She yelled, "Here it is." Joe looked and looked for his yone. Where would be a good hiding place for the yone? I hope I can find the yone. Joe looked very hard. He yelled, "Here it is."
So that gives you an example. Then after they saw the stories and listened to the stories, we showed them the items and said, "What is this called? Please name the item." So that's an example of the post-test, and we would record the responses. So here's the results. TLL's performance is the red line. The blue line are our average learners, and the green line represents the poor learners. And this is learning over time. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, that's the testing after each episode. And then 5 is after a 2-hour delay, and we're looking at retention. And as you can see, performance for TLL was on the high end. Of a total of possible 16 words, TLL recalled all by the 3rd trial. And you can also notice that his retention was quite good. So in general, the performance, he outperformed the average performance of the average learners and definitely the poor learners. In addition to the novel spoken word learning task, our participants completed cognitive tasks to see if their performance on these would predict their performance on the word learning task. I'll describe each and then I'll show you the results. So the first task is a non-word repetition task. So for example, they wouldn't see the words, they would hear NERP, and the participant had to repeat the word. Zyricad, or Mersapafendrazo, and they had to repeat the word. So this is non-word repetition. So on this task, here TLL scored at the top end with a perfect score of 18. The average learners and the poor learners were surprisingly even among the groups, among the two groups, and significantly lower than TLL. Are you with me so far? Yeah? Okay. The second task is a visual memory task. Now, the instructions of this task were, you will see a series of dots on a grid. Your task is to remember where the dots appeared. Ready? Here's an example. And here, the participant would click on the grid with the mouse to insert the dots. Okay? Cinch, right? Okay. Now, in addition, for some of the trials, the participants had to recall the location of the black dots while ignoring the location of red dots that would also appear. So here's an example of that. Okay? So there were anywhere between 2 and 6 dots that the participants had to remember, and they were mixed up. And the results. So for the visual memory task, TLL also scored on the high end. His score of 177 was significantly better than the average score of the average learners and that of the poor learners. So this was an area of strength for TLL. The next task was wordless learning. So this was also auditory, and I'll give you an example of the task. I'm going to say 15 words, and what I'd like you to do is try to remember all the words you can of the words that I say, okay? Are you ready? Yeah. All right, so try to remember as many as you can. Coffee, river, school, sheep, cloud, farmer, table, handle, key, window, tunnel, stove, apple, book, cone. Okay, you got them all? If you have a piece of paper, you can jot them down and see how many you can remember. Since we have time. Yeah. Okay. Ready? So here's the list. Now they would never see the list. The participants would never see the list. And the task this task was repeated 4 times. So each time the participants would hear the 15 words, and then they had to repeat back as many words as they could recall. After hearing 1 repetition, then we say, okay, let's do it again. Read the list again. And they didn't have to remember the words in the same order. It could be in any order, just as many words as they could. And we repeated the list 4 times. Then what we did was we said, okay, here's a second list of words, and we'd like you to do the same thing. Recall as many words as you can of this second list. So we did that 4 times. Then we went back and we said, okay, let's see how many words you can recall of the first list. And the second list was designed to interfere with the first list. And often what I would get from participants is, I can't remember any. So it's a challenging task to hold on to all of these. What you're going to see on the graph is after the first time, second repetition, third, fourth, and then after the interference of the second list, how many words could the participants remember? Now the colors are the same. So TLL is red, the average learners are blue, and the poor learners are green. And as you can see, this was also an area of strength for TLL. After the first repetition, he recalled 10 words and recalled all of them by the end, by the 4th repetition. And actually, his retention is very good as well. So after the interference, he was able to hold on to those words. All right, so what about other cognitive abilities? Well, our 4th task was a task of verbal memory. And we're looking at the ability to make a decision about sentences and hold on to words in the sentence. And let me give you an example. So for this verbal memory task, the participant is asked to listen to a sentence, such as, a flower is a type of an animal. And they're seated in front of a computer, and the participant has to decide true or false about the statement and recall the last word in the sentence. Children study math in school, true or false. And then after the series of sentences, the participant was asked to repeat back as many of those last words as he or she could remember. And the order did not matter. So these are the results. And this is one task in which TLL performed merely average. So his performance was very similar to the average learners, and the poor learners were less skilled at this. So our conclusions are, our polyglot is particularly good at word learning and wordless remembering. He was highly proficient in word learning, both for new words and their meanings, and also for long lists of English words. Now, he was particularly good at visual memory for dot patterns. So that might not seem to be a necessary skill for learning a new language, but he did say that he learned the meanings of the new words in our experimental tasks so well that he could draw the pictures, he could draw them. And he says that when learning a new language, he visualizes the meanings of words when possible. Note that, however, TLL was not necessarily exceptional on every cognitive skill. He was merely average on using his memory to recall a set of words while paying attention to sentences. So excellence in all cognitive skills is not a requirement for talented language learning. In addition, we can't distinguish whether TLL's excellent word learning and remembering is an innate skill per Geschwind and Galaberta, or one that came about through practice learning many languages, as the plasticity theory would predict, or both. We suspect it is both. We can't really tell, is TLL skilled at the cognitive skills he was skilled at because of the vast amount of practice he's done learning all these languages, or was this a predecessor to his language learning? Okay. All right. So in conclusion, for this polyglot, part of his dynamic system for learning included talent for skills specific to learning new words. And internal factors such as this appear to be important for language learning. So in sum, Erard's rote model must include at least one crucial strand for good new word learning. So we thank you for your interest, and we thank the participants of this study, and in particular, TLL. And I'll say that these are our email addresses. We'd like to continue this in the spring or the summer, so feel free to email us if you might be in New York. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Sid. Thank you so much. I'll go around with the mic now for questions. Okay, is it working? No. Okay, it's working now.
I have a question about the word list test that you were doing, and you mentioned that, I think you said on the fourth go, you gave a list that interfered with the previous list. How does that happen? What did you do with that?
So this test is called the Ray's Verbal Learning Test, and the words themselves are designed to interfere both in terms of the sounds and the meaning of the words. So to give you an example, maybe table is in one list and desk is in another list. Or there may be words that sound similar, but they're designed, and they've looked at this in experimental ways to have lists that the second list then is designed to interfere with the first in terms of recollection.
First of all, thank you. That was very interesting. Mm-hmm. As a scientist, are you at all concerned that a sample size of 1 is too small to be statistically significant?
This is why we didn't make big claims about something being true for all polyglots in the world. And it's why we invite those of you who are polyglots to contact us if you'd be interested in being tested when we have a larger sample size. It's true, however, that we have one polyglot who is exceptional on a number of tasks, but not all, which we found particularly interesting.
Among the 16 average learners, I was just curious about the deviation that you noticed among those 16, and were there any of those 16 average learners who were closer to TLL or exceeded TLL at any of the tasks? How much variation was it? Because we saw the average there.
Yes.
I'm just kind of curious as to what kind of variation you saw among those 16.
Yes, there were some average language learners who performed like TLL. What we showed you was an average. There were also average language learners who performed under TLL.
Wait, they all
Under the average language learner curve that you saw.
Well, here's
Yeah.
a curve, right? I mean, that's one of them.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
So there were folks who performed as well as TLL among the average?
for
Do we not know that
no, there were some participants who performed as well.
as well? Yeah.
Yeah.
What shocked me was that there was one person in the average language group who performed like the poor language learners, and there was one person in the poor language learners group who performed like the average language learners. But TLL was at the top and often at the peak.
Yes.
Oops, I'm pointing at of course, that doesn't help for me to point with it. And often hit the top possible score, right, which was rare.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yeah.
Among the
I think there
average
was one other person
average
among
learners.
the 23
Yeah.
average language learners. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering, do you think there might be any other confounds that could explain his average performance on the verbal memory score? So particularly maybe that was the last task that he did, so maybe there might be fatigue. And also a second part, I imagine that you could probably do the follow-up study online. There's a lot of great online tools right now for psychology experiments, so it'd be very easy to run like 100 people from this audience on these tests. And I've done some of those if you have any questions on how to implement that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. So what was the first part? I've lost the first
Are there
part.
other explanations for why TLL did poorly on what we were calling verbal memory? Because you would have thought that verbal memory would be important for a polyglot.
Right. We actually did the verbal learning memory, if I recollect correctly, early on rather than later on. You're absolutely right that it's difficult with one person. There is variability. There are other factors. But because we got such consistently good performance for the other three tasks, we feel pretty confident that we weren't, he wasn't at a disadvantage for this particular task. But certainly there is inter-individual variability that having a group of one makes it difficult. Yeah.
Here's an interesting, can I respond to the second half of that question before you ask your question? I see it as very challenging to do studies like this online because we would be challenged as to how we know the people who are responding really were polyglots, right? So people prefer that we bring in 100 people and test them in all their languages to assure that they really have competence in those languages, rather than simply have people self-report that. But if you have an answer to this problem, let us know.
Thank you.
Hello, could you please go over in more detail the difference between the plasticity theory as well as the dynamic theory and their effects that they would have on the learning languages? Thank you.
Whew, what a great question. Can I do this?
Yes, absolutely.
Plasticity theory is really a theory about the brain. And dynamic systems theory is really not a theory about the brain. So that's one difference. If you ask a dynamic systems person, hey, where is it going to be? In the heart, the hand, or the brain? They'd say, okay, I guess these systems have to be in the brain. But they're not focused on brain. Whereas people who are doing plasticity work are looking particularly at brain regions that may change over time. Like you have a patient with language disorder of aphasia, and you see what their brain looks like before you start treatment, and then you give them a treatment that seems to be successful over time, and then you look what areas are engaged after that, comparing them to what were before the treatment. And you say, there seems to be plasticity because there's more engagement of the following areas. I would see those as the primary distinction at this time.
Hi, you mentioned that you weren't necessarily able to tell whether it was, the talent or the plasticity. And would it be interesting to do some sort of study that's more longitudinal, where you took half of these average language learners and taught them, I don't know, moonwalking with Einstein type memory strategies, and tried to see whether you could not artificially, but boost their performance on these tasks?
I think that would be an interesting experiment. Unfortunately, these things cost money and take a lot of time. But it would be if you...
Suppose we took a set of people who said they were polyglots and were particularly talented second language learners, that's the term we've been using, and another set who said they saw themselves as just average. They got B's and C's in their high school class and their college classes, if they took languages in college. And you're saying we gave them tests to increase their memory abilities, say on the sorts of skills that TLL was particularly good at. What would we expect? I think what we'd expect is the people who are merely average would get better at that particular task. I don't know how much better they get at language learning, but if we're talking about a longitudinal study and a lot of money to pay them to be around and learn a new language. And we'd also expect the polyglots, the talented language learners, to get better, perhaps even disproportionately better if they have a predisposition to do well on these tasks. So I guess it would be, most interesting finding would be if they did disproportionately better. And we still wouldn't know if that was as a result of how their brains were when they were born, or how their brains had evolved plastically over time in exposure to learning the many languages they'd learned.
Yeah, and also there's other factors involved, like motivation and practice. So there's many factors involved in addition to those cognitive skills. Yes.
Hi, I'm very curious about, you pointed out that there was one of the average learners who performed very well in all these tests as well. And that points to that's related to the question I wanted to ask. How were you able to come up with this particular set of cognitive skills as indicative of language learning skill? Or because is it based on some prior literature, or is there some reason that you hypothesize that these are specifically language learning related skills? Or because I think the fact that they're average learners who perform very well potentially points to the fact that this could be a general cognitive performance that can be applied to language learning, but not necessarily.
So that's a great question. We were looking at, we wanted to know whether the cognitive performance on the cognitive skills predicted the performance on novel spoken word learning. So we were interested in looking at each of the groups to see whether or not it predicted novel spoken word learning. And in the average learner, in many of the average learners, this is what happens in science, is that you have some people who perform better, some people who perform worse. But in general, we selected things like visual memory, and we wanted to compare it to verbal memory, thinking that perhaps verbal memory, our predictions were verbal memory would be more important than visual memory. So we were actually surprised that TLL performed as well as he did.
On the visual memory task.
On the visual memory task, yes. And
as poor, or as merely normal as he did on what we called the verbal memory task, which was the listening and confusion and interference.
Yeah. So yes, there is literature to predict that individuals with good novel spoken word learning would perform in a certain way on these particular tasks. So what was the second part of your question?
Oh, I wanted to respond
Yeah.
to the piece, which was when we expand this study to focus on other skills that presumably enter into being a good language learner, we would not focus only on verbal aspects of single words, but also on sound systems, phonological aspects as well, and grammatical or syntactic aspects as well, because we figure these are also among Erard's strands that would necessarily weave together in order to produce an excellent polyglot language learner.
Yeah, I mean, this is a piece of language learning, and we recognize it is just a piece. But of course, this is kind of the gateway, right, to learning languages.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm very interested to know about the average language learners and how you categorize them, because what does average language learning mean? Did you give them the chart that you said, basic conversation words, fluent, what does that mean? I mean, did they have to answer certain questions that if they answered this many, they were put into a category? Did you have to test them? Because I think a lot of people who learn languages, they are kind of modest, like, I don't know anything, even though they can quite have a conversation. So where did you exactly categorize them, or how did you?
So these were typical American language learners who perhaps got A's or B's in their language courses in high school, but were not necessarily proficient in any language. So we really, we based the typical second language learner on the American.
And it's fair to tell people that originally the study was designed, the one you did for your dissertation some years ago now, was designed to look at people with dyslexia who had particular difficulties, to look at people with dyslexia and see what difficulties, what particular cognitive difficulties they might have that would be linked to the difficulties we assumed they would have on the neat word learning task that Peggy designed. So we spent more time being clear that we had people with dyslexia, either they had been diagnosed with dyslexia as children, or lots of people miss out on being diagnosed even if they have dyslexia, or that we could today diagnose them as having dyslexia, and then comparing them to people who reported, as Peggy said, getting normal grades in high school, but not living outside the country. Did you have that as a criterion?
Yes, we did.
For any length of time in their lives, so they were really English speakers.
So they would be comparable to the participants with dyslexia.
With dyslexia.
Yeah.
And had someone come in and said, I'm a normal learner, I know 16 languages, we would have, but no one did, we would have said, gee, we're going to save you for our next study on polyglots, because that's not what we're looking for here.
Hi, guys.
I don't see where you are. Thanks.
Just that.
Yeah.
Okay, first I want to say thank you for doing what you're doing. It's pretty awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I got a question about synesthesia and how the memories of the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic system relate to each other. It is a fact that very often we hear a song and we visually recall a moment that was relevant, and we feel the feeling.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Okay. Is this better?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. So I was saying, have you ever considered synesthesia on your studies on language learning? Like it happens to almost every human being that you listen to a song that it was significant, and you suddenly see the memory and feel the feelings connected to the auditory stimulus. And I know for a fact that many of us that use synesthesia as a strategy for learning faster. Have you thought about doing something on that respect?
Neat. I haven't. Can I just check in this audience? How many people would identify themselves as polyglots? How many people would identify themselves as talented language learners? How many people would identify themselves as synesthetics of one sort or another? It's a smaller crowd, but I bet it's larger than any crowd I usually give talks to, who say they have synesthesia. I haven't thought of it before, but I'll keep it in mind. Yeah, thanks. We're following the microphone.
Hi. I had a question relating to the verbal aspect of the study. For people that need to write things down in order to retain them, do you think that the verbal ability is innate, or is that something that also can be developed?
I'm not fully understanding your question. Richard, could you give her the mic back to say it again in different words? Because it's the written part that I'm not fully understanding.
Right, like for me, for example, if I write something down, I'll remember it, but I tend not to remember new words that are said to me verbally. So I was wondering, because you focused on the verbal aspect, is that something that you
So we were only getting a subset. You call yourself a polyglot?
Yes.
And a good language learner?
Yes.
But you couldn't have done this task so well because you like to write things down, and we were not having people write things down. Yeah, nice point. We'll have to think about that, actually. I remember when I first understood language talent was when I was studying Hebrew at a time when they forced you, modern spoken Hebrew, when they forced you not to write anything down. And there was a really bright guy in our class who couldn't learn, he knew Latin and he knew Greek, and he couldn't learn Hebrew this way. He needed to write it down. So I'm going to think of ways to add that written in. It's not totally unrelated to the synesthesia question, it seems to me. Sort of what, in fact, it could be worked into Erard's rope theory as a set of strands, a pair of strands that need to be operating together in order to help success happen.
Okay, we just have a couple more questions now.
Sure. Hi, sorry, I don't know if you already mentioned this already, but can you give us an idea of the age range of the participants and if you saw any connection between age and performance and whether, if they were all native speakers of English?
Yes, that was a requirement that they all be native speakers of English, and they were young adults between the ages of 18 and 35. So that was the age range.
I thank you very much for this presentation. My question is also about the participants and basically about TLL. Have you looked at their educational background? What did they major in, and did it influence at all?
So this was another area when we were accepting participants into the study. We wanted to make sure that they were going to be balanced in terms of education, because absolutely education can influence things like vocabulary, and vocabulary can influence new word learning. So we made sure that they were equivalent in terms of, the two groups were equivalent in terms of educational background. Thank you.
I also thank you for your insights. If you did a larger study, would you weed out people who are third culture kids or have had exposure to one or more foreign languages as children?
You mean, would we only look at late learners of other languages? Because it's so much more impressive if you acquire very high proficiency in a new language if you don't start any other language until you're 18.
Kind of having exposure to multilinguality as a child.
If you haven't had that in your childhood.
Yes.
Oh, if I was doing it right and they were funding me right, I'd have two different groups, right? The late learners and the early learners. And I'd see what difference that made.
I just have a question about the difference between the group 3 and the group 4, so the wordless learning and the verbal memory, because to me they both seem like lists of words. So this was the list of just the words themselves with the interference words, and the 4 was kind of similar, a list of words, but so in sentences, but the goal was to remember the last word, and the interference seems like, you know, trying to mark whether it's true or false, but maybe you can explain more the difference.
Oh, absolutely. So in the wordless learning, the task was to recall a list of words. And these were words that were all nouns and all imageable, but
and unrelated to each other.
And unrelated to each other. Thank you. So, and again, we looked at interference from a second list, and we were looking at learning over time. In this task, the participant had to listen and had to concentrate on the truth or not of the sentence and recall the last word. Then you're right, it was a competition in that they had to continually remember and update these words as they went along, and there were anywhere between 2 and 7 sentences. So this was a lot of information to hold on to, and they had to make a decision about true or false for each one.
Was that clear? It's true, they're not totally unrelated to each other, and the example we give here is a particularly simple one, but up with 5 sentences, I think you would find it would be hard to remember all the final words of the sentences while you're also listening to decide whether the content of a sentence is true or false. Exactly. You want to try it? I'm going to give you. Does anyone want to try it? I was.
Right. Okay, we just got time for one more question, and then we'll have to wrap things up within a couple of minutes.
4 names in the back, but we will stay around if people want to come to us with questions.
Hi, I want to say thank you so much for your presentation. It's fascinating, and I might want to talk with you more about this afterwards, but I'm wondering, you mentioned dyslexia. I'm wondering if you've studied people who have nonverbal learning disorder, and I have a mild case of it, because we have a huge, basically for those of you who don't know, it inhibits your ability to interpret and express nonverbal communication, such as sarcasm, for example. Like, we don't pick up on those things very easily. You can train yourself, which refers back to brain plasticity, but I'm wondering, because you mentioned you studied a visual memory, my visual spatial organization is inhibited. I always get lost. I have a hard time with maps. And I'm wondering if you've studied the minds of people who have pervasive developmental disorders and NLD, because I'm curious about how we could possibly use our strength of verbal and rote memory, which is very good and helps us learn languages, to improve our impairments in visual spatial organization.
Mm. Well, my background is speech-language therapy. I'm a speech-language pathologist, and I've worked with individuals with nonverbal learning disorder, but I have not done any research in the area. Maybe we could talk after. Yeah? Okay.
Okay. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.